Hello and welcome to Infidelity Tales Studio. Your support means the world to us. We'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below. Now, let's dive into today's story. The moment my wife handed me a cardboard box and told me to pack what I could carry, I knew she had no idea what she'd just set in motion. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all started. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 41 years old, and for the past 14 years, I served as the head of cybersecurity at Galloway Dynamics, a defense technology firm based outside of Arlington, Virginia. My father-in-law, Richard Galloway, founded the company 3 decades ago. My wife, Claire, was his only daughter. And the man who replaced me in both my office and my bed was a smooth-talking MBA named Derek Holt. But none of them knew the truth about who I really was. Before I became Ethan Mercer, I spent 8 years with a national security agency embedded in a signals intelligence unit, so classified that even most NSA directors didn't have clearance to know it existed. My real name, the one on my original birth certificate, is Ethan James Ashford. My father, Colonel David Ashford, was a decorated intelligence officer who spent his career exposing defense contractors who sold compromised technology to the United States military. One of the contractors he investigated was a young, ambitious CEO named Richard Galloway. My father died of a heart attack at 53, 2 years into his investigation. The official cause was stress, but I always suspected Richard had leveraged his political connections to bury my father's career, his reputation, and ultimately, the investigation itself. I couldn't prove it. Not yet. So, when I left the NSA, I changed my last name, built a new identity, and walked straight into Richard Galloway's company with a resume that made me impossible to refuse. I didn't plan to fall in love with his daughter. That part was real. Claire was smart, warm, and had this way of making everyone around her feel like they mattered. We married after 2 years of dating. I moved into the house I designed and paid for, a modern 4-bedroom in McLean that I'd built before I ever met her. For a while, I believed I could have both. The truth about my father and a genuine life with Claire. I was wrong about one of those things. For 14 years, I built Galloway Dynamics' entire cybersecurity infrastructure. Every firewall, every encryption protocol, every intrusion detection system. I also quietly documented everything Richard didn't want documented. The government contracts where specs were downgraded after approval. The testing reports that were falsified. The overseas shell companies that funneled profits away from tax obligations. I stored everything on a private server that Richard didn't know existed, because I had built the network he didn't understand. 3 years ago, Derek Holt joined the company. Richard hired him as VP of Business Development without consulting me or anyone on the technical side. Derek had an MBA from Wharton, a jawline that belonged on a campaign poster, and absolutely zero understanding of defense technology. What he did understand was people. Specifically, how to manipulate them. Within 6 months, Derek had become Richard's golden boy. Within a year, he'd become Claire's secret. I noticed the signs gradually, late meetings that didn't appear on any calendar. A new perfume Claire started wearing that I'd never bought her. The way she angled her phone screen away from me at dinner. I didn't confront her. Confrontation is what amateurs do. Instead, I did what I was trained to do. I observed. I documented. I waited. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 days before Thanksgiving. Richard's assistant asked me to come to the executive conference room on the 7th floor. When I arrived, Richard was seated at the head of the table. Derek sat to his right, legs crossed, smiling like a man who'd already won. Beside them was a woman from HR whose name I'd never bothered to learn, holding a manila envelope like it was radioactive. Richard didn't look at me. He looked at the table. "We're restructuring the technology division, Ethan. Your position has been eliminated." 14 years, I said calmly. "And you're telling me this 3 days before Thanksgiving?" Derek leaned forward. "The industry's evolving, Ethan. We need fresh perspective. Younger talent, nothing personal." I studied Derek's face. The faint trace of Claire's lipstick shade on his collar. The confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. I almost felt sorry for him. The HR woman slid the envelope across the table. Inside was a severance package and a non-compete agreement that would bar me from working in defense technology for 3 years. Richard had clearly consulted lawyers who didn't understand Virginia employment law. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out without signing anything. When I pulled into my driveway 40 minutes later, Claire was standing in the garage with 2 suitcases. Not hers. Mine. She'd packed them while I was being fired. The coordination was surgical. I stepped out of the car slowly. She couldn't meet my eyes at first. When she finally did, her expression was rehearsed, sympathetic but firm, like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. "I think it's best if you find somewhere else to stay for a while," she said. "Until things settle down. This is my house, Claire. I designed it. I paid for it." She held out a folded piece of paper. It was a printout from an extended stay motel off Route 50. The kind of place with weekly rates and stained carpets. She'd circled the phone number in red ink. "Dad thinks a clean break is better for everyone," she said. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. You'll be hearing from them." I looked at the woman I'd spent 12 years building a life with. The woman who used to fall asleep reading on my chest. The woman who now couldn't look at me while handing me directions to a motel. "How long?" I asked. She knew exactly what I meant. Her jaw tightened. "That's not relevant right now." "How long, Claire?" She exhaled. 8 months. I picked up the suitcases, loaded them into my trunk, and drove away without another word. In my rearview mirror, I saw her standing in the driveway, arms crossed, already reaching for her phone. Probably calling Derek, or Richard, or both. What none of them knew was that I'd been preparing for this day for 2.5 years. 20 minutes from the house, in a quiet residential neighborhood in Falls Church, I owned a second property under my birth name, Ethan Ashford. I'd purchased it through a trust 5 years earlier. The upstairs looked like a normal apartment. The basement was something else entirely. 3 monitors, a secure server rack, encrypted communications equipment, and a wall covered in documents, photographs, and connection maps that traced every dirty deal Richard Galloway had made since 1996. My former NSA colleague, a woman named Jenna Park, was already there when I arrived. Jenna had left the agency 2 years after I did, and now ran a private intelligence consulting firm with clients on 4 continents. She'd been helping me compile the Galloway file for the past 18 months. "They moved faster than we expected," Jenna said, handing me coffee. "Doesn't matter. The timeline accelerates. Everything else stays the same." Jenna pulled up a series of financial records on the center monitor. Richard's offshore accounts in the Caymans and Liechtenstein. Derek's insider stock trades. The falsified testing data on the Meridian Defense contract. A $340 million deal that had earned Galloway Dynamics its biggest government partnership. "Phase 1? Jenna asked. "Phase 1. That night, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Margaret Liu, a senior investigator at the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. Margaret and my father had been colleagues 20 years ago. She tried to continue his investigation into Galloway after his death, but had been shut down by political pressure. When I told her I had 14 years of documentation from inside the company, she went quiet for 10 seconds. Then she said, "Tell me everything." The second call was to Samuel Okafor, a partner at one of DC's most aggressive securities litigation firms. Samuel specialized in whistleblower cases and had a success rate that made defense contractors lose sleep. I'd retained him quietly 6 months earlier, paying from accounts Richard didn't know existed. The third call was to a number I hadn't dialed in years. A man answered on the first ring. "Ashford. It's been a long time. Colonel Beckett. I need access to my father's classified files. The ones that were sealed after his death." There was a pause. "You sure about this, son? Once that box opens, it doesn't close." "I'm sure." For 1 week, I went completely silent. No calls to Claire. No appeals to Richard. No LinkedIn updates. No apartment hunting. No visible signs of a man whose life had just been destroyed. Claire texted me twice. The first said, "I hope you're settling in okay." The second, 3 days later, said, "We should talk about the house." I didn't respond to either. What I did was work. 18 hours a day. Jenna and I assembled the most comprehensive case file that had ever been built against a defense contractor from the inside. Every falsified test report, every bribed inspector, every line of code I'd written that Richard had repurposed for contracts I'd never approved. Every email between Richard and his lobbyists, discussing how to neutralize oversight. We organized it chronologically, cross-referenced it with government contract records, and packaged it for 3 simultaneous deliveries. The DoD Inspector General, the SEC, and the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. On day 8, Richard's world began to crack. It started small. A routine inquiry from the DoD about testing protocols on the Meridian contract. Richard's lawyers handled it with their usual arrogance, submitting documentation that I knew was falsified because I had the originals. The DoD investigator, guided by Margaret Liu, asked follow-up questions that revealed inconsistencies. Richard's legal team scrambled. The same day, the SEC opened a preliminary investigation into unusual stock transactions by senior Galloway executives. Derek, who had been buying and selling Galloway stock based on information from Richard's private briefings, suddenly found his brokerage account frozen pending review. Claire called me that evening. Her voice was different. "Ethan, something's happening at the company. Dad is losing his mind. Investigators showed up today." I answered with silence. Then, "That sounds stressful. Do you know anything about this?" "Why would I know anything, Claire? I'm just an unemployed cybersecurity engineer living in a motel, remember?" She hung up. I allowed myself a small smile. Then I went back to work. By week 2, Galloway Dynamics stock had dropped 31%. 3 board members had resigned. The Meridian contract was suspended pending investigation. And a reporter from the Washington Post had received an anonymous package containing just enough documentation to justify a front-page investigation into defense contractor fraud. Richard held an emergency board meeting. I know this because I had built the company's video conferencing system, and the backdoor I'd installed during a routine upgrade 4 years earlier still worked perfectly. I wasn't spying for personal amusement. I was ensuring that when Richard inevitably tried to destroy evidence, I'd have real-time documentation of the obstruction. During the meeting, Richard blamed everything on a disgruntled former employee. He meant me, of course. He told the board that I'd been fired for cause for security breaches, a lie that his own HR records contradicted. He ordered the IT department to audit every system I'd touched. What the IT department found instead were the breadcrumbs I'd intentionally left, traces of Richard's own unauthorized access to classified files, his personal use of company servers to manage offshore accounts, and Derek's security credential being used to access areas of the network that had nothing to do with business development. The IT director, a man named Craig Weber who had worked under me for 9 years, called me privately that night. "Ethan, what the hell is going on? The stuff we're finding on the servers. Did you know about this?" "Craig, everything I knew has been reported to the appropriate authorities. I'd suggest you cooperate fully with any investigators who contact you. And Craig, document everything Richard asks you to delete." There was a long silence. Then, understood. On day 16, I made my public move. Through Samuel Okafor's firm, I filed a federal whistleblower complaint under the False Claims Act, alleging that Galloway Dynamics had systematically defrauded the United States government through falsified testing, inflated billing, and deliberate concealment of product deficiencies in systems used by active military personnel. The complaint was filed under seal, as required by law, but its existence became known almost immediately because the DOJ moved to intervene. When the Department of Justice intervenes in a whistleblower case, it means they believe the allegations have merit. Galloway Dynamics stock dropped another 22% in a single trading session. Richard called me for the first time since he'd fired me. His voice was raw. "What do you want, Ethan? Name your price." "I don't have a price, Richard. I have a conscience. Something you've lacked since you destroyed my father's career in 1998. The silence that followed told me everything. He'd never known who I was. Not once in 14 years. "Your father," he said slowly. "David Ashford. Colonel David Ashford. The man who tried to stop you from selling compromised radar systems to the Navy. The man whose career you buried. The man who died at 53 because you made sure no one would listen to him." Richard's breathing was ragged. "That was business, Ethan. It wasn't personal. It became personal when you fired me, turned my wife against me, and handed me a printout for a motel. Everything after that is consequences. I can fix this. We can make a deal. You can't fix 14 years of fraud, Richard, and you can't fix what you did to my father. The only thing you can do now is cooperate with the investigation and hope the judge considers it when sentencing." I hung up. The following weeks were methodical and relentless. The FBI executed search warrants at Galloway headquarters and Richard's home. They seized servers, financial records, and personal devices. Derek was arrested at Reagan National Airport, attempting to board a flight to Dubai with a bag containing $200,000 in cash and a passport under a name that wasn't his. The charges included securities fraud, insider trading, and obstruction of justice. Claire called me again the night of Derek's arrest. She was crying. "Did you know about Derek and me the whole time?" "Yes." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because your affair wasn't the crime I was investigating, Claire. It was just the distraction your father used to remove me from the company before I could finish what I started." "That's not," she stammered. "That's not why it happened. Derek and it wasn't part of some plan. Maybe not for you, but your father introduced you to Derek deliberately. He moved Derek into the office next to mine. He sent you both to the same company retreat in Napa. Richard needed me distracted and eventually disposable. Derek was the tool. You were the mechanism." Another silence. Then, very quietly, "What happens to me?" "Nothing happens to you, Claire. You're not implicated in any of the charges. You'll keep the house since your name is on the deed alongside mine. The divorce will be standard. I'm not going to destroy you." I could almost hear her bracing for the butt. "But I'm also not going to save you. Your father's assets will be frozen. His legal fees will consume everything that's left. The lifestyle you've known is over, and I won't be there to rebuild it for you." I filed for divorce the next morning. No fault. No contest. I asked for nothing from Claire because I'd never needed anything from her. The house in McLean, which I'd paid for entirely, I signed over to her in the settlement. Not out of generosity, out of indifference. That house belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. The federal investigation expanded over the following months. 11 current and former Galloway executives were indicted. Richard faced 47 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction. Under the False Claims Act, as the whistleblower, I was entitled to a percentage of any recovered funds. The preliminary estimate was between $15 and $25 million. But the money was never the point. 6 months after the day Richard fired me, I stood in a conference room at the Pentagon alongside Margaret Liu and 3 DoD officials. On the table was a complete reassessment of every defense system Galloway had delivered to the military over the past 2 decades. My technical analysis had identified vulnerabilities in 11 active systems, including radar arrays on 2 deployed aircraft carriers. "Colonel Ashford tried to tell us this 20 years ago," Margaret said, looking at me with an expression that carried 2 decades of frustration. His son finished what he started. I thought about my father in that moment. The man who'd spent his last years being ignored, discredited, and slowly broken by a system that protected the powerful. He never got to see this day, but the work he started was finally complete. Richard's trial began the following spring. I was called as the prosecution's primary witness. For 3 days, I sat in a federal courtroom and testified about 14 years of fraud, falsification, and corruption. Richard's defense attorney tried to paint me as a vindictive ex-son-in-law with a personal grudge. The prosecution responded by entering into evidence my father's original investigation file, now declassified, which showed that Richard had been committing the same crimes for 3 decades. Richard was convicted on 39 of 47 counts. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Derek, who had cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, received 7 years. Claire attended the sentencing hearing. I saw her sitting in the back row, thin and pale, wearing a coat I didn't recognize. She didn't approach me. We hadn't spoken since the divorce was finalized. I heard from mutual acquaintances that she'd sold the McLean house and moved to a small apartment in Richmond. The social circle that had once revolved around the Galloway name had evaporated overnight. I felt nothing. Some people think revenge is about anger. It's not. Anger burns out. Revenge built on anger collapses under its own heat. What I built was constructed with the same discipline I apply to every system I design. Patience, redundancy, and structural integrity. Every step was planned. Every contingency was accounted for. Every outcome was predetermined. 3 months after the trial, I launched Ashford Security Systems under my real name. The DoD, now fully aware of the vulnerabilities I'd identified in Galloway's products, awarded my firm the contract to remediate every compromised system. The initial contract was worth $180 million over 5 years. Jenna came on as my chief operating officer. Craig Weber left what remained of Galloway, and joined as our technical director. On the day we signed the DoD contract, Jenna handed me a framed photograph she'd found in my father's declassified files. It showed Colonel David Ashford standing in front of the Pentagon, young and sharp in his dress uniform, holding a briefcase full of evidence that no one would look at. I hung it on the wall behind my desk. A year later, almost to the day, I received a letter forwarded through my attorney. It was from Claire. It said, "I understand now why you never told me who you were. I wouldn't have believed you. My father was my whole world, and I couldn't see what he really was. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I finally see clearly." I read the letter once. Then I put it in a drawer and closed it. Forgiveness is a word people use when they want the person they hurt to make them feel better about what they did. I wasn't in that business. I was in the business of building systems that protect people, the same business my father had been in, the same business that had cost him everything. The difference was that I finished what he started. And nobody, not Richard, not Claire, not Derek, not a single person who had underestimated me, would ever have the chance to take that away. My name is Ethan James Ashford. I am my father's son, and the systems I build don't have vulnerabilities. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you in the next one.